Welcome back to the Disaster Tough podcast. I'm your host, John Scardena. I am so excited for this episode. Several months ago, we were talking to Steve Johnson, who has been on the show multiple times. He's a true expert. You guys have heard his opinions. He teaches at dynamic populations with us. We see him at different events. Right now, I think he's in Thailand for some big conference. So he does lots of really cool stuff. Well, anyways, we were talking to him and we said, hey, we need to find copycats of you because we need other experts in the field who can really help push the agenda of best practice, doing really great things in the field. Do you know anybody else who is like you in that kind of world? And he told me all about Barry Moss. Barry Moss is just this like genius, incredible thinker who really dives down into the analytics. He hates that I call him a genius so often, but it's true. And so when I met Barry, we just had this like worlds collide moment where it's like, oh my gosh, he's doing so many great things in the UK. We're trying to do good things here. And we just meshed very quickly. We really liked him. And I introduced him to the team. Everybody gave him a big thumbs up. And so we brought him out to dynamic populations in St. Louis and literally on the fly, because if you've heard, Walt Lewis had to go back home. We had some agenda stuff happening with hurricanes. And I said, hey, Barry, would you mind doing a presentation literally on the fly? And he said, I got this. He went up there and he just did this knockout presentation all about risk assessments, how the UK looks at it, working from the hospital perspective, because he works with a lot of hospitals and emergency management. He also has a military background. The guy has just figured it out. And so at the end of that presentation, this very rare moment where myself and my entire senior staff were all taking notes on what he was saying. And that is a huge nod to him and the work that he's put into trying to do things right. And the fact that he did it on the fly told us that he really knew his stuff. And so I've asked Barry to come onto the podcast to share some of those same thoughts and to talk to me about risk assessments so that you, the listener, can learn more about the UK's perspective, compare that to your own, and really take your own emergency management program to the next level. So with that very long introduction, lots of good things about Barry. Barry, welcome to the Disaster Tough podcast.
Good afternoon, John. How are you?
Oh, I love that British accent. It makes me feel so special inside. All right. So Barry, first things first, before we get into how awesome you are, I found out about how awesome your house was. It was built in like 3000 BC. Can you tell us about your house real quick and that wall behind you?
So no, it was me that was made in 3000 BC. I think I'm that old, really. But no. So this is a wall in my house. Welcome everybody to my house.
The wall.
There's a door and a wall. So that is a chalk lump wall, built in the center of the house in about 1750, maybe a little bit earlier.
Wow.
1750. Now, what happened after 1750? Let me just think about that for a second.
We put England back in its place. That's what we did.
Oh, did you? Well, there you go. I knew there was something important happened, but I just couldn't quite remember. So yeah, my house, a little village in Norfolk, the real Norfolk, not your Norfolk. And I've lived here for about 16 years, but this place has been around considerably longer. It's this chalk lump stuff sits in the middle of the wall normally, but we stripped off the coating and lime washed it. But it's the rest of the house is built of the same thing. But when you look to the front of the house, you'd see flint fronted, and it's all sort of flints that have been chipped and then stuck into cement and put on from the house. In fact, we did the roof about a month and a half ago, and the guy took the old roof, the coverings off, and then got to the timbers, and he said, these timbers are probably original on your roof.
Wow.
He looked at them, and they were all hand cut, and they were angles, and they were bent, and all this sort of stuff. We kept most of them, but it's old, but it's like me, old but functional. Keeps
old
going.
But functional. We'll take that.
Yeah, cool.
You've mentioned that twice now about your age, and yet I figured that you're probably one of the innovators. Just from like that random perspective, because Rodney Melsick, who's been on the podcast, is like that as well. Talks about like how seasoned he is, and yet staying at the forefront of things. How have you been able to make sure that not just having the experience, but making sure that you stay cutting edge with your chops?
So it goes back a bit of time to probably when I was in the military. And every time, people know when you're in the military, you get posted every 2-3 years to a new job. And whilst you do your specialization and you go to do your job, you tend to find that you have to reinvent yourself every few years into a new thing. So I went from, I don't know, infantry work into some tanks, back into air defense with missiles, into CBRN, into training, into helicopters, into CBRN again, all sorts of stuff. So every few years you reinvent yourself in a new thing.
Cool.
Same guys that you're working with and different places, but you reinvent yourself. So when I left the military in 2012, 2012, and I got into this sort of work in my own sector, my own business and whatever. And I was looking at, this is what I know, and I was looking at guys and girls who'd left the military and got into a similar line of work. And a lot of them have been doing the same thing for literally a decade or more after they left the military. And they got to a point, some of them, where they were out of date and they were still trying to hawk and sell what it was they did 10, 15 years ago, but it was out of date. And I looked at them and I thought, I don't want to be like that. So I took, John, my inspiration from Madonna.
From the what?
From Madonna.
Okay. From Madonna?
The pop artist.
Yeah.
So Madonna reinvented herself every few years, didn't she, into a new thing. So I thought, well, she can do it. Why can't I? So basically, I left the military, did a load of counterterrorism work, got into nuclear power station emergency management. We did a lot of things with counterterrorism overseas at the same time, went into school security, moved as well into our health service, the NHS, National Health Service, in case I'm going to mention that again, maybe, and ended up just using the same skill set that I'd had since I was probably 18, 19 when I joined the military. They the military give you skills. They give you planning skills and command skills, and they give you knowledge and training about how to integrate information into planning and deal with the risks and all those things. They just don't call it that.
Yeah.
And so I took all those things and a bit of knowledge I picked up on the way, and then got into these sectors and just used the same skill sets, but changed the information, if you like. I think that's the best way to describe it. Change the information, use your skills. And if your skills are generic, the information's the only thing that changes. And if you can understand that, and this is important, if you can associate the information with what you're trying to deliver, and as you always say, the mission is the important thing, then all you're doing is just taking information, using your skill sets, knowing what you're trying to achieve, and you're in. You've done it.
Real quick, we're going to pause for this week's Disaster Tough endorsements. The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapsed and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. Okay, let's jump back in. Yeah, I like that so much. So, it draws on this thought process. I actually have 4 or 5 different conflicting thoughts, but the mission for me, like that, you're talking about that skill set / mission. What I find fascinating is that a lot of people who come from military or especially like fire and police service into emergency management, their mission set beforehand was life-saving, life-sustaining on the tactical level. And yet what I found is that once they move over to emergency management, somehow they think their mission has changed to like doomsday preppy, whatever, write the plan. That I don't know what happens. And I've been trying to like figure it out. Like, why do people quote unquote become stagnant? Is it because they give up? Is it because it's easy? Is it because they're tired? Is it because they're afraid? Is it because they're out of their element? Like, I don't know. I'm sure the answer is different for a lot of people, but it does seem to happen to a majority of people. Like even me, I've been doing this for 15, 20 years now, but I'm excited. Like I work on all these different projects and I want to be in it. I don't know what happens to people, why they give that up. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's individual. we're all individuals, and
Nah,
we end up,
sheep.
yeah, well, so we end up with it's lots of those things combined. I know people who've moved out of emergency services or military and gone into a job in emergency management, if you like, and they just go, fine, I'll just take the money and I'll leave at the end of the day, and we don't worry about it. And if the boss says we don't get to do that thing that they say you really got to do, boss, and the boss says, no, I don't want to do that, they go, fair enough, boss, we'll just leave it at that. Whereas if my wife was studying that, she would say, that is not very. He will not do that. He will not give up. He will not. So what did she say the other day? She said, you just won't do the wrong thing. And I have to be honest with she's known me quite a while now. And she nailed it in that, yeah, I won't. If there's two choices and it's the wrong thing and the right thing, there is no two choices. There's just one choice. And that's
absolutely correct.
And I tell you a weird thing, because when first time I met you on an online thing we were doing, and you talked about the mission. So when I was, how old had I been? 18, and I joined the military, and I went to training, and they showed us a picture of the first leadership lesson, and it was 3 overlapping circles, and it was what did they say? It was mission, it was team, and it was individual. And I've heard it described as mission, man, self as well. But they were overlapping and all that, and there was a bit in the middle, it was a sweet spot. But they always said to us, if you're going to do anything, I mean, bear in mind this would have been 86. So those of you quick on the maths, all that. And they said to us basically, if nothing else happens, if nothing else matters, if you can't do anything else, the mission is it. And the team, and then yourself, because it goes in that order, are the subsequent things. And where was I? So I was probably coming towards the end of my career in the military. So I've been doing it about 24, 25 years at that point. And I sat down and was having an appraisal with my boss. And he said, I thought people like you were all dead. I said, what do you mean? He went, people who literally believe in mission, man, self. And that's what he said to me. And I went, well, isn't that what we all do? He went, no. He said, people don't do that. And lots of people don't do that anymore. Yeah. There's sort of people who did, but I mean, this is 12, 13 years ago. And he went, no, that's not the way it works these days. People think, and I don't know how to describe this because he always sounds patronizing and insulting when you talk to people about this. But if you're going to do this sort of game, if you're going to be in this field, if you're going to try and be effective in it all, it's not a popularity contest. We are not here to be popular with our bosses, with our peers, with our whoever it is. We're here to achieve a thing that ultimately may save people's lives, that will save people a lot of money, will be a hassle, whatever. But it's not a popularity contest. And was it my team when I was doing the helicopter job? We had this really small team, this weird thing. And they were like, when it comes down to it, you're not very happy the first thing in the morning. I said, well, sometimes I'm a bit grumpy. And they went, yeah, but it's difficult to like you. And I went, I don't need you to like me. I just need you to understand what I'm trying to achieve and contribute. I'll be fair. I want to be happy, but I'll be fair. I've changed, obviously, because now I'm just a lovely person, but
Thinking about like the mission, I've also been, interestingly enough, I wouldn't say accused, but people say to me, people don't talk like that anymore. They'll say that to me all the time. People don't talk like that anymore when I talk about the mission. And there's this real thing. And I think I did a whole podcast on it about narcissism and gross narcissism. Instead of mission, team, person, everyone thinks that like first me, mission if convenient, definitely not team. And that's what I have found has been the perpetuating trend currently is if it works for me, fantastic. It has to work for me or nothing else. Mission, yeah, if it works for my schedule, absolutely, all in. I can feel good about that. But team, there's all those social media about making fun of businesses who say hey, we're a family, right? There's all those jokes about that. And yet at the same time, as a small business owner, I don't sleep. I think about the people who have chosen to work for me, all the risks that they've taken on their lives. I pay them first before I pay myself. And while, yes, my immediate family is my real family, I deeply care about these people. Mm-hmm. And I only want to work with people who care about the mission. And I'm very lucky to have a close group of friends, and you're now included on that, who do care about the mission, who
Very
want to do it the right way. Because you're right. Like anybody who's, in my mind, who considers the right way versus the wrong way to do something for convenience is not the crowd that I hang out with. At the same time, the only thing I might push back a little bit on what you say is that we have to learn to be agreeable and likable in order to convince enough people to get the job done. If nobody likes you or nobody wants to work with you, then you're not going to be able to move the needle. So you got to figure out when you can yell at the boss and when you need to just say, hey, that's a good idea. And for those who are listening or trying to figure that out, who don't know which battles to fight, my meter goes like this. Is it going to impact life, property, or continuity of operations? Yes. I have to put my foot down. If it's an opinion based off of like, where are you going to eat lunch? Nobody cares. Don't fight that. And so if it's impacting lives, got to put your foot down. If it's just about opinion about, how the document's formatted, whatever, nobody cares. So that's where you can kind of choose to where you fight your battles. I don't know. That's what I'm thinking about it.
No, I agree. I mean, you can be popular all fair, but you can't be both because they don't sit together. But there's no point in being fair and rude because the people won't work for you then. You need to be fair because if you're fair, people want to work for you. If you're, I know people who are fair but quite harsh and they don't achieve as much as the person who is fair and, issues out a bit of a telling off with a smile on their face, but a serious intent, and you can get things done. But then you can also come down to the point of when's it time to not be polite and say please, because sometimes some of your audience who are emergency responders will automatically default to that understanding and go, sometimes I'm not saying please because we're just going to go and do this thing and it's dangerous. We all accept it because we're into it and it's cool. And I was the same when I was in the military. You do that. But if you can say please, then why don't you? Because it doesn't hurt. It's just a word, and it might elicit a brilliant effect. So yeah, I know I agree with you. I also think that when it comes down to choices that people make, I do subscribe to the theory that some people make them in a certain order according to their personal priorities, should we say? See how subtle that British that was. Anyway.
Doing these mic drop moments. We're gonna have to take all these quotes and just make them like Blaster or social media with them. But,
so some people do that, and that's fine. But I'll tell you what's weird. He's coming over to do DyPop in St. Louis, and seeing how the audience you had there, how keen they were, how fresh they were, how interested, how dynamic they were. And then coming back home over here again, and I suppose it's a bit like the entire Britishness that we'd all appreciate, is that, we could be quite dour, we could be quite cynical, but in our emergency management field, we've got a lot of people who aren't excited by it anymore. And it was I said to you at the time, didn't I, when I came over there, I said, it's really nice to be with some people who are really interested and keen.
Yeah.
And I don't get that over here. I really don't. I get competency and I get experience, and I do get some of those people you're talking about as well. But sometimes it's just not very exciting anymore. And when you get to a certain point in your career, you need a bit of excitement. You need to
keep going.
Yeah.
Burnout's also real. I mean, but at the same time, you might be your vision. I think UK and the US are much more alike than you seem. The DyPop is interesting because, one, it's very expensive. We know it's expensive, but we wanted to pull at all the stops. And so it charges people a lot. But it forces people to really advocate for themselves to their boss of why this is important, or to do the work to get the UWASI grant, because you can go with the UWASI grant, or to find a way to come. We've had people said, hey, can't afford to come, but I really want to come, and they made their pitch. And we were able to find them a scholarship. There's all these different ways. But basically, by putting that value there, the price value, and now some people are going to really push back about what if people can't afford it? I just gave you 3 or 4 different ways to be able to afford it. Grants, you literally just have to do the work. It forces it so when everybody comes, they really want to come. They want to see it. They've invested into it, their time, their money, their resources, being away from their family, the whole deal, all that stuff. So by the time they come in the room, we've, without too much manipulation, you could say, is all the recipes already there. They're already cooking. That being said, the class is very small, and we have I'm talking a while here, but 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, the average age of the emergency manager in the U.S. was 45 years old. And I took a picture at a conference where it's actually really messed up. I took a picture of a conference where everybody's walking out of the hotel after the conference, all khaki shorts, huge dudes, super old, white tennis shoes, like 50 guys, all like that. It was like, but you fast forward now, and the average age is now like 33. It's becoming younger.
Yeah.
And so when you have a field based off of a lot of retirees, some people just care about a check, and some people are really passionate. And I think we need to figure out how to, as a field, not get people exhausted, so that whether they're retiring or brand new, that they do have that excitement in their life.
And I'll tell you another thing about it is that the younger people coming through with, degrees and masters and things like that, which are, eminently more valuable. For me, it was entirely learning the job. But people coming through with that, and there's a couple I work with quite regularly, and talented, yes, knowledgeable, brilliant. The one weakness, experience, and unfortunately, you don't get that in a book, do you? And to be honest, I mean, I'm not particularly academically, certified, as it were, but you can read voraciously, you can endeavor to understand, and if you take that, and I suppose this is important, we'll circle right back to the beginning when you started me saying we'd talk about risk, because we're getting on a bit in time here. Right. Anyway, but when you're looking at risk of things, which ultimately for me is everything, if you can't understand your problem risk, then you're not going to come up with an effective solution. And so I often find when I'm dealing with people who've got the academic basis for the job, when we stand there and we say, okay, this stadium, and we need to evacuate, and we need to deal like we did to Louis with a chemical that had been spread around. It was an exercise, by the way, folks. Then we are not then necessarily, some people weren't focusing on what are the public going to do here. And yet, when you sort of apply experience to things, and some reading and some exercising and some real deals, and then you realize that actually, whatever it is we want to do as emergency managers or responders is lovely, but ultimately it might not even work, because all those people who were affected are not going to do what they were told. They're not going to do what you want them to do. They're going to do whatever they want to do, but whatever they think is best. And if you, I've got my friend Louise, who I'm trying to convince to come on one of your lovely podcasts. Right. But she talks about how the public know things and are not as dumb as a lot of people like to think they're going to be. And if we leverage that by understanding risk, by articulating risk to people, because people get it, they get the fact that this is going to be a problem, they'll then sort some of their own solutions out. If we can push them in the right direction to the solutions we'd like them to do, because it helps us, then we're just leveraging what they do by helping them to understand what it is we do. But we can't do any of that unless we've done a decent understanding of the risk. And that's where it comes down to for me. Because when I was talking at the DyPop, I was talking about the UK and its current problem with a thing called, and check this out, listeners, reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, RAC, RAAC. Look it up, UK RAC, and it'll tell you all about the schools that have got this in, and it's a crumbling concrete that's been around since the 60s and 70s and 80s, and a 30-year shelf life, and plainly we're way past that. And there are hospitals made out of it. And there are people literally in hospital beds underneath these planks that are younger than my house, but less stable. And what they're doing, and this is everywhere, is that we are standing in front of the people in the buildings, and this happens not just with this RAC, but lots of different things. And we are accepting the risk for those people. We are turning around and we're going, let's get some surveyors in. Let's look at what this means. You go to, maybe some of your listeners may have heard of Grenfell, the big tower block in London that went up like a big candle with a cladding on the outside. If you haven't heard of that, look it up. But we let people stay in structures when we know there's a problem, when we know how serious it is, we might not have the absolute detail, which is the excuse we use to not do anything because we haven't investigated properly and done 3 years worth. So for 3 years, you can sit in that building while we think there's a problem until we confirm it. For me, that just goes that we how can you do that? And then the classic is we don't tell them. And so you, John, could be sat in this hospital, in this school, in this tower block, and nobody has said to you, John, did you know that you're in a building with a huge risk? Are you prepared to accept that? Because we've accepted it on your behalf.
Yeah.
And therefore you're in blissful ignorance of a problem that you assume everybody's taking care of for you because they wouldn't let us in a building if there was a problem, would they?
Well, that's exactly what we're talking about, right? That selfish mentality of like, well, I don't live in that building. If it goes down, Surfside building collapse. They knew about the problem.
Yeah.
2 dams in Michigan that gave way. They were told 20 years prior that there was a problem. You can trace back like almost every single like major like catastrophic human accident, quote unquote, to somebody saying this is a problem, and people are like, and nobody knowing about it in the building.
Yeah.
In the U.S., several states I found out through a buddy of mine who runs his own podcast, Tell Us How to Make It Better, George Siegel, found out, he does like all this stuff on homes, that in most states, you don't have to tell somebody if the home is flooded when you go sell that home.
Right.
I wouldn't want to buy a home if it's flooded before. There's so many problems. You can't buy a car technically. There's lots of people who do it illegally in the U.S. But if a car has flooded from like a natural disaster, you can't resell that car. But you can buy a house that's been flooded and you don't have to tell people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
there's a whole lot of stupid out there that we accept as normal. The problem is, like, as you who identifies risk and deals with risk, how do you convince the stakeholder that it's a big enough problem for them to do something about it?
Yeah. That is a distinct problem, because you can try the whole line of, if you don't tell people or you're letting this happen, you'll go to jail. And people sort of, they can't associate that with reality, that threat of that. So in some ways it's worthwhile mentioning, but other ways it's pretty pointless. You can end up with trying to explain to the not the risk holder, but the people who are subject to the risk, and they can then try an influencing way of getting people to understand it all. We had a thing in London a few weeks ago where there was an unfortunate young man who was shot by the police in a car, who was in the wrong car at the wrong time, and they thought he had a weapon. And the officer who shot him is now in charge of murder, at which point reportedly 300 armed police officers, and we don't have that many in the UK, all handed in what's called their firearms tickets, their authorization to carry weapons. They said, we're not carrying them anymore because the risk to us is too great to do a thing. Now, when you get to that point where you've not only got a risk to somebody's life who's doing their job because somebody might have a weapon, you've not only got a risk to their liberty because they did something that perhaps in the heat of the moment they should or shouldn't have done. And then you've got the whole public opinion piece for them. You can see why people are not keen on even investigating risk and understanding. They just want to avoid it, because we are set up in societies to allocate blame. It's what we do. And if you're in our game where you are actually literally saying that's a problem, you've got to do something about it, and you're trying then to convince people that there is a way out of it, or there's going to be blame, then people would rather not know about it to avoid the risk of the blame than actually solve the problem or make a decision. Go back to the pandemic. How many decisions were there in your country? There was lots in mine where people did not make decisions about closing airports, letting people go on their skiing holidays in March 2020, cancelling Christmas, stopping people. They just wouldn't make those decisions because there was no evidence that said they should do that. They didn't want to be unpopular. Go back to that popularity thing again. But the risk of pandemics globally has been known for, hundreds of years and maybe more. But where was that risk management to stop the problem?
Yeah.
I mean, you could have all sorts of arguments about the rationality and the
oh my gosh. I mean, even as soon as you're talking about, as soon as something becomes political, and all disasters are political, to be honest, but once it becomes hyper political, game over. I mean, we had a prominent politician over here go into Chinatown, San Francisco in March of 2020 saying, if you're saying the coronavirus, comes over from, China, then you're a racist. And then months later, criticize the president for not closing down all the ports fast enough.
Yeah.
And so it's like the whole thing is just a crapshoot. Like once something like that, it's like happens. COVID-19 response was doomed from the start because of politicians.
Yep.
You're talking about trusting the public. I called that out on episode, and I think it's worth calling it out again. In Hawaii, they didn't press the button for the sirens because they were afraid that it'd be associated with tsunami. They didn't trust people to go outside and be like, oh, the water's still there, but there's a raging wildfire 10 feet from my house. Maybe they're talking to me about the wildfire. Now, at the same time, when we do conflicting messages and they're complicated and we're using our own vernacular, that's when we confuse the public. It's incredibly important for us to find common language. It goes back to the whole ICS thing. ICS is not common language for the public, by the way. So, like, for example, when anybody in operations calls themselves an operator, I'm like, you're not a black ops, right? You're not like killing the bad guy. But like all that stuff it just goes back down to when you're identifying risk to your own career is a great way to start as an emergency manager. Risk to the public is another great way to start as an emergency manager. And I'm going to do the last call out because we're running out of time here, is stop using your gut. You got to back up anything what you're saying with data, or you're just embarrassing at this point. There's enough sources out there to say, hey, there's evidence of why I'm saying this. It's not just like, because I think all things are bad are going to happen. Because eventually somebody's going to lay blame, and it's usually back to us if we don't do our job. Great to have some documentation to back up what you were saying. So.
Yep. Yeah, and I've done such a lot of this over the years where it actually, as you say, that evidence comes in many forms, doesn't it? It doesn't come necessarily just in scientific research or figuring out that concrete will crumble or that virus will spread. It comes in the fact that people with qualifications and experience can walk into a stadium. I've done a whole bunch of those where you walk in there and you can simply stand back and go, okay, we know there's a threat, and we know it's either a bomb, a knife, a gun, the vehicle, whatever it's going to be, and that's the place. And I can see the security, and I know where the people are. And if I was the bad guy, which is where personally I always start, which slightly fun but a bit weird,
it is super fun.
And then walk up to the location and go, how would I do that? And this is my motivation. It's a bit like acting. What's my motivation for the role? What am I trying to achieve? What's my mission as a bad guy? And if I know what my mission is, and I know what I've got to do it with, so intent, opportunity, and capability. If I've got those three things, and I know what it is I want to achieve with all that, pretty much there's your evidence of how to do that. And for people to say that won't happen, we're talking about then countering human nature, and that is a bad thing to do.
Just the other day, I think you shared it. Some other people shared it with me. Politicians and stadiums are worried about drone attacks in stadiums right now. If only there was an organization out there who has been specifically targeted. I mean, man, who would that?
I don't know. I can't think.
Oh my gosh, so weird to think how unique.
Yeah. Somebody ought to Google that.
Up with DyPop and using drones and chemical weapons and the whole deal. That's not based off of some Hollywood thing, by the way. And for everybody who's listening, for Barry, what we're talking about is using after action reports and learning how the bad guy, what the steps they took. You can, in the U.S., DHS and the FBI both have the steps to terrorism, the steps that they take in their process, and learning how they act. There's lots of different data there. Barry, we're out of time. If you're going to give some advice for somebody who's looking into doing like a real risk assessment, where would you tell them to start besides thinking about the bad guy? From the data perspective or from the stakeholder perspective, where would you start in understanding the risk for a community or for a campus?
I would do a hybrid of that. I would start with the data and how it supports the bad guy's intent. Because that's where the problem is. And if you don't know that's a problem, everything you do, and this is a problem you get with many emergency response plans and capabilities that are developed, we always develop them to do what we want to do in the way we want to do it, or what we would expect to happen.
Yeah.
When actually every single plan or response you put in place has to be started from hard data, bad guy's perspective, dealing with that, and then flip it when you manage to get control of the situation to now what we want to do. So it's a hybrid, it's a perspective, it's a don't think that you're going to get it right because you do what you want to do, because you won't, because the bad guy and the members of the public are all going to vote in this. So there you go. That's what I do.
The biggest, I love that. And the biggest call out I'm going to give to everybody who's thinking about doing that is when you're going through this, you are a prudent person. The bad guy is not. They're insane. They're evil. They're manipulated. They're all these kind of things. And so the more you can use that hybrid approach of data, interactions, understanding the complexities, like getting eyes on things, qualitative and quantitative, smashing that all together, that's how you become an expert of actually getting out there. Barry, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your perspective. We got to get to come back. It's always a pleasure to hear from you and to learn more about your house that was built before the United States.
John, an absolute pleasure and a dream, sir.
Oh my goodness. Compliments from a British person always feels good. Hey, so if you got something out of this podcast, which you should have, you got to give us that 5-star rating and subscribe. Big news. If you check out the readinesslab.com website, we just launched something that's going to help our podcast and the other podcasts on our network stay alive, basically. We've launched our own paid subscriptions. It comes with a ton of stuff, from audio tabletop exercises that come out every month to discounts on our merchandise to all this really cool stuff, newsletters and webinars and updates. We're even thinking about doing some digital downloads for people as well. Or you could just give us a small donation to help us keep the lights on and that kind of stuff. So if you're willing, please check out the readinnesslab.com for the new subscriptions that have just launched, and we will see you for the next one. Thanks. Peace.